Greg Chafuen serves as Senior Counsel for the Alliance Defending Freedom in their Center for Public Policy. He crafts legislation and advises government officials on policies that promote religious liberty and other civil rights. And Dr. Jay Richards is the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center at the Heritage Foundation. And he does a bunch of writing and research and all those sorts of things. Very academic gentleman. The focus for this next panel is on the LGBTQ revolution and specifically its impact on religious liberty in the United States. And Dr. Richards, I want to start with you. You've studied and written on the sexual revolution quite extensively, especially in recent years. I think it's fair to say that we've seen an acceleration of that revolution. Personally, I think a lot of it can be traced back to Obergefell, but there's a lot of other influences as well. And we've seen an acceleration of that revolution, especially in young people. Walk us through how you've seen that landscape change in the last number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. So, here we are. Things have definitely accelerated, but they've also radically changed. So you mentioned Obergefell, which is, of course, the Supreme Court decision in 2015 that basically wiped out many state laws that define marriage as intrinsically involving a man and a woman. And in some ways, that was the ratification of the sexual revolution. A lot of people, and a lot of us conservatives for a long time, thought the sexual revolution was about elevating sex and making it a really important thing. Well, if you thought that, you're going to have a sort of weird paradox, because it's now led to us sterilizing children and destroying their sexual function, which tells you that's not actually what the sexual revolution was about. What it was about was dissolving the organic connection of sex, marriage, and childbirth. Those things going together, and in the 60s, you needed a technology to be able to make that realistic so that people could have sex without babies appearing. That was how the pill was sold to us. That's not what actually happened. Out-of-wedlock sex went through the roof. A lot of children born out of wedlock or pregnancies out of wedlock. And so what we get? We got abortion to solve the problem, right? So notice if marriage is not about, in its nature, mating and reproduction, right, then what do you do in 2015 in a state where you say, well, we're going to define marriage as between a man and a woman? And the Supreme Court's going to say, well, we're the barometer of cultural views, which is unfortunately what they are. Lawyers hate it when I say that, but you know, they basically ratified what the culture had decided in the 60s, which is that marriage is not about bearing and raising children. And so that's, in 2015, the Supreme Court decided that the sexual binary is not relevant to marriage. What's next? The sexual binary itself. And then that is exactly what happened. So basically a week after Obergefell was decided, if you look at the magazine covers of all major magazines, it had a trans cover on it. National Geographic, it was a boy looking like a girl. That was the year of Bruce Jenner on the cover of Glamour magazine. So you see how this is going? This is the sexual revolution as a train, and it's about to run off the tracks. And it's now directly attacking the reality of sex as a biological category. That might sound crazy, but you know, give me a few minutes. I'm pretty sure I could persuade you that's exactly what it's about, but let me just sort of boil it down. A person that's committed ideologically, doctrinally to gender ideology will never, ever use the word sex by itself. They will talk about a gender identity, which if you press them, they'll tell you is an internal sense of gender, which is weird, because then the definition and the thing being defined have the word gender in it. Notice that, right? So they'll talk about a gender identity. It's this kind of gender soul thing that's sort of detached from your body that floats around. And then you'll say, but what about sex? I mean, you've got these different body parts and reproductive systems, and doctors can almost always tell if somebody's a boy or girl. We can all almost always tell, right? What will they say? They'll say, oh yeah, of course there's biology. That's true. We're not challenging biology. No, they won't say that. They will say, well, doctors came to associate certain body parts with sexes, male and female, and then they assigned those to us. So you see what gender ideology says? Sex isn't real. It doesn't sort of capture human experience. Rather, we're these disembodied gender souls, and our sex is just something's assigned to us as a stereotype. So now, how do you help a child who is feels his or her body is sort of not what he perceives it himself to be? So a boy feels incongruent with his male body parts. Well, how do you fix that according to gender ideologues? It's not by conforming their minds to their bodies. Gender affirming care means gender identity affirming care. And so that means you change the body and the pronouns and the social surroundings to conform to the stated gender identity. That's where we are right now. This is an attack on civilization. It's obviously an attack on religious liberty for anyone who believes that God created human beings, male and female, right? So it's obviously an attack on religious liberty, and very often that's the flashpoint. It's also an attack on reality itself as known by everyone in using natural reason for all of history. So, right? So it's a religious liberty issue, but in some ways that's a proxy war over a battle over reality. And that's why I actually think we're going to win this, is because unlike some other kind of complicated issues about the nature of marriage and even conception, right, and human beings, we know from embryology when human life begins at conception or fertilization, but nobody experiences that directly with their eyes. Everyone at all times and places has known what boys and girls are, right? And so that's why I think actually we're already legislatively and culturally seeing successes on this that we did not see on marriage and we've not seen in abortion and some of the other things. That's the bad news. And the good news is also that it might be an occasion for the culture finally to wake up to the evil nature of the sexual revolution.
Yeah, and one of the things that you said just reminded me of the opening to Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, where he opens and he says, 50 years ago, if you had gone into a doctor and you said, "Doctor, my body tells me I'm a man, but my brain tells me I'm a woman," the doctor would have said, "Okay, well, let's get your mind in line with your body." And today you go in and they say, "Okay, well, let's get your body in line with your mind." That just tells you how far we've come in that respect. If you haven't read it, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, excellent resource on this sort of thing. But Joseph, this last legislative session, there were a number of bills here in Kentucky introduced on this particular topic of religious freedom and the sexual revolution, which failed to get through the General Assembly. Some of these include House Bill 47, which was an update to Kentucky's RFRA, Senate Bill 147, which would have protected children from sexually explicit businesses and performances like drag shows, and Senate Bill 239, which would have protected conscience rights of healthcare providers. These types of bills, why are they so important, and should we give them another try this next session?
The answer is yes, but they're important for a number of different reasons. I'm going to focus on two. So the conscience rights for healthcare professionals, and by the way, just we at FPA prefer to use the term healthcare professional rather than healthcare provider. I'm not undercutting you, Nick. I'm just saying this is just one of the reasons that in our lexicon we use professional, because provider implies that they owe you something. Whereas healthcare professional implies they have a professional ethical duty to you, which we all agree on and have fought to establish what that really means. But the reason this is so important, Nick, is because this is an assault on the conscience rights of medical professionals. It's kind of the next frontier, not just in the sexual revolution, but in issues like abortion as well. So there's was that, Greg, you can correct me if I'm wrong, was that the Med Act, the same thing? Okay, so we've publicly endorsed the Med Act written by ADF, which is the best protection for medical professionals' conscience rights we've seen yet. It's got a very all-encompassing definition for different healthcare providers that, me personally, I like that it includes pharmacists, because that's one of the other frontiers, is as the abortion industry moves into leaning on chemical abortion, they really want to make sure that pharmacists can't say no to dispensing that. So anyway, that's one of the reasons why it's so important. But the other, and I think this will ring true for a lot of you, is it protects against, there's this new concept of a right in America where you have a right to things. And I don't hesitate to call that un-American, because traditional American rights are rights from something. So I have a right to the government not infringing on my religious practice, or a right to the government not squelching my speech. And the implication of that is that if the government did nothing, like it doesn't have to lift its finger, it will never infringe on either of those rights of mine. That's a traditional American, and I would argue Western common law English notion of a right for the last 1,000 years. The kind of rights we're seeing now is if you look at certain of the abortion ballot initiatives for state constitutions, the language they love to use is a woman has essentially a right to an abortion, right? Well, a right to a procedure like an abortion requires someone else to do something. It requires a medical professional to perform the abortion on them in order for you to be given your right. That's an inversion of the rights paradigm that we're used to. And protections for medical conscience rights actively militate against that new notion, that new paradigm. So I think it's important for that at a deeper level. And then I'll also just mention when it comes to the other bill, like protecting kids from sexually explicit performances and things like that. You've heard me talk a little bit about this attempt to sexualize kids at a younger and younger age earlier. These kind of bills protect them from that. Yes, they do have First Amendment implications. I think that it's possible to work around those, as we've seen some states really make good efforts to do, and the only simple answer is that the jury's still out jurisprudentially. But I think there's a way to do that, especially now that we know how harmful it is to sexualize kids. And to tie this into just the progression of the sexual revolution as a whole, drag shows is one of two ways, the other is porn, that the LGBT agenda proselytizes its way of life onto younger generations. This is their marketing strategy. It's these kind of shows get kids to the drag shows, and it's pornography. And I'll give you some proof of that, and this is actually encouraging. In that case that I mentioned earlier from the Fifth Circuit upholding Texas's age verification law for online pornography, this is a direct quote. And this was taken from the Attorney General's brief, so they knew that this is going to be one of the main movers and shakers about getting the law right on this. A review of literature from 2013 to 2018 finds a correlation between frequent use of online pornography and distorted gender orientations, insecurities, and dissatisfactions about one's own body image. Now, I could talk for an hour about why that's true, but the bottom line is this is how kids get confused sexually. And the other thing that case established for us that's so important is that it is rational for the legislature to want to protect kids from that. So this is a good policy objective. We need to pursue it, and we just need to pursue it. If we're going to win at it, we've got to get it right with the First Amendment. But I think that's possible, and our kids' security and who God made them to be depends on it.
Greg, you work for ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, which a lot of what they do, not all, but a lot of what they do is fighting legal battles on behalf of individuals who have had their rights infringed. And ADF has had a victory in a case here in Kentucky, actually over in Louisville, involving the transgender movement and free speech. Josephson versus, is it Gansel?
Yep.
Talk to us about that case and other cases like it that you're seeing around the country that ADF is handling.
Thanks, Nick. And this gives us an opportunity to focus on a real-world problem. You know, these things, they're not just ideas. There are real people that are affected when these ideas come and when governments use them to push people out of their jobs. Before I tell his story, I just want to thank Nick, thank David, thank Kent, thank everybody here at the Family Foundation. The work that they do really does change the everyday life of people in the Commonwealth here. We are so happy to work with them. ADF recognized them as the best policy group of all of the national groups. Every year we choose a different one. Kentucky group here. So they're great people to work with. So keep giving them your support and don't let down. So with that, so the story of Dr. Alan Josephson, he is a man who is a psychiatrist. He's a doctor, and his career lasted 40 years, expert in his field, and his specialty was for minors and adolescents, so young kids. So he's a doctor helping young people with their mental health issues. I think we have a picture, he's the top left in this slide. And so obviously, as an expert in his field, he would travel around and give talks at different places, different panels, expressing his views, his medical views on certain issues. So when he went to medical school 40 years ago, there was a fairly different country, and not all of the issues that are front of mind today were then there present. But about 14 years ago, he became the chief of a division at the University of Louisville. So this is a case coming out of your own state here. And he was the chief of a division that focused on psychiatry and psychology for children and adolescents. And so if you think, so things came to a T in 2019, and so 14 years prior to that, early 2000s, these issues weren't that much discussed back then. So he had a long time of helping children with mental difficulties by talking with them, going through their processes, whether it's anxiety, depression, all these sorts of things that can be underlying mental health concerns for children. So then 2017, no surprise that he was invited by the Heritage Foundation, Dr. Richard's group. The Heritage Foundation had a panel discussion about what are some good treatment options for children that are suffering from gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is real. You know, children do suffer from this they feel a mental incongruence between how they think and feel in their body, and it needs to be addressed. So the question is how to address it. What do you do? There are some that would say the dogma is you just put them on pills and a lifetime dependence on surgeries and operation and dependence on things that studies have shown do not actually create better outcomes for people. So 2017, Dr. Josephson went to this Heritage panel and he shared his thoughts that we need to slow down, ask questions, do scientific studies, and actually follow the results. Is it a good idea to just put them on hormone blockers and then surgeries and off to the races? Or should we do more scientific study and research to talk about talk therapy and recognize the fact that vast majority of children that do suffer gender dysphoria will naturally grow out of it if you just let them naturally go through adolescence? So he goes back to his university, University of Louisville, and soon thereafter, folks from the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender office of the University of Louisville contact administrators above Dr. Josephson and end up in very short period of time getting him removed as the chief of the division that he was in charge of for 14 years. And again, he had excellent, stellar reviews in his annual performance. No reason to remove him, but for his expression of his own private views, not as the University of Louisville, but his own private views at a panel in DC one weekend. And it went downhill from there. That was in 2017. Life already turned upside down, removed from his prestigious position. He was not allowed to teach anymore. He was required to do a bunch of menial tasks that entry-level psychiatrists would do. He did them to the best of his ability, but on top of that, he had colleagues then that were putting him under the microscope, trying to look for any excuse to write up issues or things that he might have not done right so they could kick him out. And this all culminated in 2019 when he was effectively fired, when the university says, now we're not going to renew your contract. So that's when he became our client, and we filed a complaint in 2019 saying he was fired for his free speech rights, expressing his private opinions, and removed from his job for that. This is America. It's a public university. You should not be able to police people's opinions and views that way. And that was 2019. So yes, we got a victory. Just last month, the appellate court said, you can proceed to trial. And that is a victory, because we can proceed to trial, which means something might happen from this. But in a sense, a Pyrrhic victory. So you win, but we've lost a lot in the sense that was 5 years ago. A prestigious psychiatrist, doctor of 40 years, lost his job, kicked to the side for expressing concern about medical science and how it's been progressing. So while he might get some kind of remedy, which is another thing that we'll get to about what kind of remedies are there, what message does it send to not just other people at University of Louisville, but all the other universities, all the other hospitals in this Commonwealth? That's a big message. So to turn it now to the solution, I don't like to leave it like that. The solution is there is a legislative fix. It's Medical Rights of Conscience Act. There's conscience rights that says doctors shouldn't be forced to do things that would violate their conscience, but it also includes free speech protections. Doctors should not be fired because they're questioning the dogma of what scientific organizations say you have to do. The scientific method is about having hypotheses and testing them, asking, is this actually good medicine or not? So if you can pass legislation that says you cannot lose your license or be fired for asking those kinds of questions, then people like Dr. Josephson would not be able to be removed when he goes to a panel and asks these kinds of questions. So there is a legislative fix, and I'd say it's should not be controversial because it's good for the doctors, it's good for the patients, and it's good for medicine. Good for the doctors, of course, because it allows them to actually fulfill their oath to do no harm. Everyone down to the pharmacist who's there dispensing drugs. They should not be forced to give things out that they think will actually harm a patient. If it's an opioid and they think that this person is coming back too frequently and it might harm them if I do, there are conscience rights that these people need to be protected against and not be forced by their employer just to make their bottom line look a little better. Good for the patients, because without this sort of freedom of conscience or free speech rights, patients won't have options. You'll only be able to go to the kind of person that the state says you're allowed to have. One of the worst, most troubling statistics that I saw was from a survey that 20% of medical students will change the direction of their field of study because of concerns about conscience rights. But of those 20%, 80% leave the field of OBGYNs. That means pro-life nurses, pro-life young men and women that would otherwise be fantastic doctors. And there are shortages for OBGYNs across the country, including here. But they're not entering that field because of concerns about their conscience rights, that they won't be protected. So you think about mothers that want a pro-life provider to help them with their pregnancy and delivering their child. There just aren't people in those fields because there aren't the conscience protections. And of course, as I mentioned, good for medicine, because to get good medicine, you need to have good studies and questioning the results and repeating those studies until you come to an answer. And as Dr. Richards has said, you're not getting that in this gender area just because there's a dogma that you are fired and removed from your profession, like Dr. Josephson, if you even mention the possibility that it might be erroneous. So it's a real problem. There are real legislative, we're here, we're policy folks, so we're talking about what policies can fix the problems. Medical rights of conscience is one. Just very briefly to wrap up, part of the question was if this is happening in other places. Yes. And for every other example where we have clients that we represent, think of how many hundreds others are people that either keep their mouths shut because they don't want to risk losing their job or that promotion, and how many people will be penalized but then just can't find legal counsel. So we're blessed at Alliance Defending Freedom to be able to serve a lot of people, but we can't serve everybody, and not everybody knows about us. Thank goodness there are other groups like First Liberty and Beckett Fund, Institution for Justice. There are a lot of groups out there that are doing this work, and we need more of them because we provide the free legal services that people like you all can knock on our door if you need protections. But there are plenty of cases. So just these three other ones real quick. People punished for speaking the truth, people punished for not telling a lie, and people punished because they want to help folks. So so go back to the previous slide if you could. That second will be for the next question. But so in the bottom left, Professor Peter Vlaming, French teacher, he had a student who was a female one year, came back the next year, and the female wanted to be referred to with male names and male pronouns. Peter Vlaming was a very nice guy, participated in a lot of extracurriculars, everyone loved him, and so he said, look, I will call you whatever name you want. I will totally accommodate, I want to make you comfortable here, I will use the name you want. But I think it would be a lie for me to use a pronoun that is for the male sex if you're female, so I just won't use the pronoun. Compelled speech, he just didn't want to say it. He would use the name that the person preferred. He was fired for that. It wasn't enough. He had to say the pronoun or else he would lose his job, which he did. He lost his job. Another person was Coach Block up in the top corner. He was a snowboard coach. He's got the goggles on his head there. He shared the truth. So he was at before a meet. Two of his people on his team were saying, oh, the other team has a male competing on their female team. And all he did was share the fact that, look, I believe that there are males and females. DNA is in every cell of our body. Males tend to have physical advantages over females. It was not a contentious conversation. He just shared that opinion. And for that, next day he goes to the school, and he was fired for that, for just sharing a basic truth. Problematic. So again, you need lawyers that can back you up. But how many people are there that either wouldn't even say that or can't find the legal counsel to help them? And finally, Professor Tingley, I can mention him a bit later, but he was a counselor in the state of Washington, wants to help kids that are with these issues, like Joseph and Dr. Richards were saying. When these kids are told lies and have this confusion about themselves and are uncomfortable about their life and how to move through adolescence, they're looking for help. And they want to talk with somebody that can talk them through these things. And Counselor Tingley, he has these terrible stories of kids that cannot be helped because you have these bans that are shutting them up. It's the government coming into the counselor-client relationship saying there are certain things you're not allowed to talk about, to the client as well as to the counselor. So medical rights of conscience legislation actually protects them. It will stop these employers from discriminating against them for their free speech rights. And if things do go south, it allows the lawyers to actually take swift action to make them whole as soon as possible.
Now, Dr. Richards, one of the things that you've advocated for in recent years legislatively is actually clearly defining male and female in state law. Talk to us a little bit about that. Absolutely.
So yes, we have lived to the moment where we need to define precisely what a male and a female are. Yeah, I'm here for it. And so you're wondering probably why that is. But what happened is in 1972, we have there's a federal law called Title IX. Was an amendment to the previous Civil Rights Act, and it basically says there shall be no sex discrimination in federally funded context. So the growth of women's sports in colleges in the last 50 years, I think, is in large part due to Title IX. It occurred to no one to say what sex is, right? And so the Biden administration, as soon as it got in, decided they were going to, through the rulemaking process. So, we follow, most policy people, we sort of follow what a legislature does, or a governor or a president, when actually most of what's actually happening in Washington, D.C. in particular is in these regulatory agencies. There's stuff you can do through the rulemaking process. So the Biden administration had basically submitted a clarification of Title IX to say that sex shall be interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity. So they notice they're not redefining sex because it didn't get defined in the first place. So the fact that it didn't get defined, they're going to say it's equivalent to sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, obviously, those aren't the same thing, right? So sexual orientation refers to one's sort of attraction or orientation to someone else. And then gender identity, as you heard a minute ago, is this internal sense of gender, which no one even ever had that idea until day before yesterday, right? So that can't possibly be what sex is. And so this has been going through the kind of rulemaking process and comment period. A lot of us have written comments to try to slow it down. It finally was basically finalized in August, so a couple months ago. The good news is it's tied up in litigation now, but the effect of this move, if you're wondering, if it were to stand, would be to destroy the category of biological sex in federal law. And so Title IX, it's not just like a thing related to sports, it's sort of the sort of uber regulation for the federal government. So the way sex is understood in Title IX, if you're wondering, you're dealing with some other law and you're wondering, okay, how do we understand it? You refer back to Title IX. And so you see how obscure this is? A lot of you probably didn't even know this was happening. And the Biden administration has managed to get here at the end of the first term in succeeding in an effort to blow up the category of sex in federal law. That's what this means. And so if there's sort of stand, and you're the state of Kentucky, for instance, and you want to separate boys and girls bathrooms, separate male and female sports, keep men out of women's prisons, it's just sort of obvious stuff like this. But let's say there's a man who identifies as a woman, and so wants to be put in the women's prison. The Justice Department under the Biden administration could sue the state for violating the man's civil rights, not the women he's going to be victimizing. All right, so you see how this works? It's that insane. And so a bunch of us, including a lot of state legislators around the country, realize, we really need to have a precise way, a non-arbitrary, non-capricious way of defining male and female in state law. So at least we could say, actually, we know what sex is and we know how to define it. This ends up being a lot harder than you would think it would be. And so I suspect what you're thinking in your head is that this is easy. Oh, female is X chromosomes, male is XY chromosome. That's the trap the ACLU planted in your brain, because that was the idea everybody had at the beginning. Here's the problem. That's not the definition of sex. That's the normal sex determining mechanism in humans. But if you define sex as like, everybody's male or female, if you have an XX chromosome, you're female. If you have an XY chromosome, you're male. What's the ACLU going to do you think? They're just going to find a member of your state that has a different chromosomal arrangement and take them to court and say this person under this law is not a male or female. So do you see the problem? There's actually it's a small percentage of people have chromosomal variations. And so you got to get the definition of sex right. It involves actually what you already knew. It involves reproduction. So sex is about the gametes that you produce and the reproductive system that corresponds to that, which is kind of obvious, right? If it were chromosomes, that would mean we didn't know what sex was until we discovered chromosomes. So this ends up being difficult, but a coalition got together about a year ago, and we got a really, really, really tight definition of male and female that we think will stand up to legal and biological scrutiny. And there are about half a dozen states that have succeeded now in doing that and implementing it. A couple had vetoes by governors. And then the definition has now found its way into other legislation, including FPA legislation and ADF legislation. So that's the good news. We want to give states a fighting chance, and we want the other side to have to make explicit what they have made obscure until now, which is this. they don't ultimately think sex is real. They think a thing called a gender identity should trump biological sex. We also think that they don't want to make that argument explicitly before a court, right? Because it sounds completely insane. And so you want a bill that at least forces them to have to make that argument, and we think certainly the Fifth Circuit, but maybe even the Ninth Circuit, when they realize that gender ideologues are actually denying basic biology, that the courts themselves, even the more left of center courts, will finally push back. So that's the hope.
Greg, you mentioned on this slide here, one of ADF's clients was a counselor, or is a counselor. Many people in this room probably are aware with an action that Governor Beshear took a number of weeks ago to ban so-called conversion therapy in the state of Kentucky. Now, he has very loosely defined conversion therapy in such a way as to basically include anybody's religious objections to the LGBTQ revolution. But talk to us a little bit about executive orders like this and what we as a state can do to push back.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think it's where I left off chatting before was about Counselor Tingley's experience in Washington State, where it's a counseling censorship ban. It's the state saying there are certain things you can say and certain things you cannot say. And why that's fundamentally problematic is because kids are coming to people like Counselor Tingley looking for help. And they need to be able to have open, frank conversations, speak freely. They don't need the governor there in between the client and the counselor. And that's what these things are doing. It's a censorship ban forbidding counselors from helping kids with mental health issues, from addressing them in an open manner. And it's very problematic when you just put all of these pieces together of, schools that will be telling children that they can choose between a boy and girl. It's not having to do with their body, then leading to confusion, that then leads to gender dysphoria, then leads to very difficult mental problems. And then when they want to address them and talk about them, there's no other answer but transgenderism. That's what these are doing. The censorship says you cannot help somebody be comfortable with their physical body because that's what they're calling conversion therapy. Being comfortable with your own body is conversion. It's not. The idea is if children need to be learning to be comfortable with their body with open conversations with their counselors, and if you have the state stepping in, stopping the counselors here in the Commonwealth from doing that, it's hugely problematic, and unfortunately, kids will suffer from it. So the biggest problem with these conversion therapy bans, counselor censorships, is that it keeps the truth away from children who are suffering. Kids are really suffering. Counselor Tingley, I've heard him speak on a number of panels. It's heart-wrenching, literally heart-wrenching. The kids that come to him and they tell him these stories, of course he keeps them all confidential, but just what they've gone through and how they can't speak about things, and for him to not be able to help them through their issues because there's a censorship on the kinds of counseling he can provide in the state of Washington, it really does a disservice to kids. It's very harmful and it's very problematic. So what can you do? I think we'll have to wait and see what the implementing regulations are for his particular executive order. But one of the things that if you read it, you can just see, he says, we'll do this insofar as it's consistent with the laws of the state. Well, the legislature passes laws. And so if the legislature passes laws protecting free speech rights of counselors, again, the Med Act has this. 5 states have passed this in the last 3 years. I think Tennessee and Idaho passed laws particularly regarding conscience rights for counselors. So this is very much an issue that states are looking at, and you can actually do things. If you want more resources, by the way, on medical rights of conscience, there's a table in the back where Matt Lorimer, my colleague, has a number of resources for medical rights of conscience legislation. But that's what you can do. I think you can have policies that make counselors know that they are safe in providing open and frank conversations with their clients without the government stepping in between.
So for our legislators in the room, get ready for those phone calls, okay? Dr. Richards, one of the things, in addition to defining male and female in state law and all that, that you've actually written about is school choice. And it may seem a little out of place at first, but we have a school choice amendment 2 on the ballot next month that we at the Family Foundation are fully behind and would strongly encourage that everybody in this room support. Now, while the amendment itself does not prescribe a particular approach to school choice programs, why is school choice as a concept essential in enabling families to push back against the cultural madness of the sexual revolution?
Well, it's interesting you ask it that way, because this, if you were to follow the school choice movement for the last 40 years, until, let's say, 3 years ago, what you would have seen is basically loss after loss. And it was because the school choice movement decided they wanted to try to appeal to a political cross-section of the populace. And they realized actually a lot of inner city minority kids are by far the worst off. They're in terrible schools, there's crime problems, and they're stuck just because of their zip code in this location. And so the school choice movement didn't talk about these things, like the bizarre sex education that kids are getting, the indoctrination in gender ideology, and there wasn't a lot of success. The school choice movement mostly decided a few years ago, actually, let's talk about the stuff that parents are really interested in with their own kids, which is the terrible, either just the academically substandard stuff, but in particular the morally toxic stuff that they're getting in public, or what I would say is government schools. That's changed things so that a lot of states have started implementing these. Now, of course, the devil's in the details with this bill. Any of these bills, Heritage generally supports education savings accounts that attach directly to a kid. Now, of course, the government and activists can try to regulate anything, even if you're homeschooling, right? They could try to regulate that. So you're not going to get outside of the sort of risk of regulatory capture, but what you want to do is minimize it. But what you really, the way to sort of think about this is not what is the perfect here, but compared to what. So what would be better than a functional educational monopoly that states have over the minds of our children? Something that forces a little bit of choice and competition. And so the reality is, school choice will make some public schools better, because that's what choice does. When there's choice and competition in the market, it brings the price down and it increases the quality. We know this in economics. The same thing's going to happen with educational choices. People say, well, you're taking money away you'll destroy public schools. Well, why would that be? The money can go to the public schools too. It'll just travel with the kids. They're implying that the public school in their area perhaps isn't very good. It will either improve or actually probably, my view is it should close down, because that's serving the kids and they'll be served somewhere else. So I think that as long as the details are right, this is one of the most important weapons that we have in our arsenal, especially because of this. If you look at the demographic sort of situation in the entire developed world, we're below replacement rate now. Y'all have heard about this, right? So we need to be at basically 2.1 children born relative to every woman of childbearing age just to replace the population. The United States and every country in the industrialized world, with the exception of Israel, is not reproducing itself, all right? So we're having fewer and fewer children. Now, there's an interesting detail on that religious people, once you sort of control for a few variations, tend to have more kids than non-religious people. There are no atheists with 8 kids driving big, long trucks or big, long vans, right? I mean, you guys know this. All right, so what the left, though, realizes that you got to get people when they're young. This is why you have drag queen story hours for 5-year-olds and not in retirement homes, right? You got to get them when they're, as Rush Limbaugh said, their brains are full of mush. But if they're not having kids, how does this work? They have to recruit your kids. That's how it works, right? And like it or not, government schools are the primary way that they reach children when they're small. And so if you don't have a plan to break up that monopoly, you just basically say you're not going to fight. So that's why, obviously, there are complications. We want to prevent, regulatory capture, but this, I think, is one of the most potent ways to fight back against this stuff.
And Joseph, just generally, it's important for us as Christians to promote a biblical view of marriage and the family as we seek to, bring the population back up to replacement rate. But with this sexual revolution, what are some ways that you've seen that states are successfully pushing back and strengthening biblical marriage and biblical families?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are several ways that we've seen successful, and several that we're pushing and we think will be successful. And I want to emphasize this doesn't just happen at the state level. It happens at your local level. So one of the ones that I'll specifically mention, because it's very popular right now, is getting pornographic literature out of your school's libraries. There's groups like ours and Heritage and ADF, and a lot of that are, workshopping how we can do this at the state level. But a lot of the real legwork for this is being done right now at the local level. It's being done by school boards. And I want to just do a plug for one of our programs, which is the School Board Academy. If you're interested in making a difference through your school board, not necessarily serving on it, but engaging with them to do policies like this, we have model policies for you from a very similar state group to the Family Foundation about how to get these kind of materials out of your school's libraries and curriculums. If you're interested in that, the Family Foundation folks can connect you with the School Board Academy. So that's one, because kids are spending, as Dr. Richards just said, so much of their time there. That's where they get them young. Another one I want to emphasize, because it's also hot right now, is with custody issues. So I'm going to mention a case from Indiana called MC and JC versus Indiana Department of Child Services. This is just, MC and JC are just acronyms for two parents. These are Catholic parents who lost custody of one of their sons after he began identifying as a woman, and they would not call him by the preferred pronouns. And they lost at every level, including their state Supreme Court. And then they appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States, and their appeal was rejected. Now, there's a hope in this, which is that during the appeal to the Supreme Court, the child in question, quote unquote, aged out. He turned 18, which means that the Supreme Court now no longer had a remedy to deliver. They couldn't deliver the child back to the parent's custody anymore. We call that mootness in jurisprudence. So that's the hope for the reason why the Supreme Court didn't object to this, because this is a clear violation of a parent's right to direct the upbringing of their children. But until the Supreme Court takes and rules correctly on a case that does deal with these custody issues, states are kind of on their own to deal with this, to make sure that family courts and just state courts generally do not favor, quote unquote, affirming parents. There are many ways you can do this. I would encourage the legislators in the room to look into it. We have one piece of model language you could consider. We call it our Model Custody Protection Act, and it just tries to ensure that in any custodial dispute, states can't favor or disfavor affirming or not affirming parents, essentially. It's trying to level the playing field. You can go stronger depending on your political situation, but that's one. And then just the last one I'll say, it's not really a piece of policy, but because, as Dr. Richards has so well illustrated to you all, people are running headlong into the broken promises of the sexual revolution. You need to be prepared to speak to the true biblical narrative of sex that is so much more attractive. Because Christianity, at least real Christianity, is a minority now, we gotta sell this to people, but we can't. This is the most sellable thing there's ever been, especially in the wake of what we're seeing. So don't hesitate to talk about sex from a biblical perspective in the context of marriage, the truth we know, and why people should adopt it.
And especially for pastors, church leaders in the room, if you are not quite sure how to address this, please contact us at the Family Foundation. We are happy to help you to tackle this difficult circumstance, because this is something that the church needs to be able to speak a positive vision into. I think one of the reasons why you see so many young people who are being captured by this ideology is because they're looking for what they think is a positive community to belong to. And they've been sold the lie that this community that has come about by the sexual revolution is a positive, affirming community. Well, the reality is, as soon as you step outside of what they think, that community will kick you right out. They'll turn on you. And so we as the church need to be able to step into this situation and provide a positive vision for young people as they're going through these difficulties. Just to end, Greg, before we take our break prior to lunch, focusing on the topic of religious liberty more generally. Here in America, we have many protections for religious freedom compared to other countries. But I think one of the things that people often fall into is they see the First Amendment, they see protection for religious liberty in our Constitution, and they think, okay, well, we're perfectly safe. We shouldn't have this idea that religious liberty is under threat in America. We're fine. We need to be focusing on maybe religious liberty issues in other countries. Why is that the wrong idea to have? Why is that the wrong view?
many ways to answer it, and I'll be very brief because I don't want to cut into your break. But the Soviet Union also had a very good Bill of Rights protecting religious freedom and equality, and we know how the Soviet Union treated pretty much everybody. So it's only as good as what it's worth. So the First Amendment protects the free exercise, yes, but 30 years ago the Supreme Court actually changed what it means, and it doesn't protect religious freedom rights that much. If they make a rule, but they changed, it used to be like free speech where if anything burdens your religion, the government has to show that it has meet a very high burden to show that it can stop your religion. 30 years ago, the Supreme Court said, unless the government passes a law that applies to everybody, which means if they say no one can have wine during Prohibition, for example, any religious ceremony that might use wine, that's fine, according to the First Amendment, according to the Supreme Court right now. And that was the wrong result, we think. But so Congress and many states passed what's called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act to try to give, from a statutory level, that same level of protection to religious freedom. Y'all in Kentucky have a RFRA, but you're missing a very key piece, which is the piece that you can actually put it into effect. So right now, if the government here burdens your religious liberty rights, you can't use that law. You have to ask the governor to defend your religious freedom rights. And depending on who the governor is, you might have more or less success.
And how many of us remember what Governor Beshear did during COVID? Right?
So the solution to this one is, there is a bill that was introduced last year, I imagine it'll be reintroduced this year, of just updating your RFRA to use strong, robust language. 20 other states have RFRAs, and yours is the briefest, but you can just model yours based on what other states have done to make sure that your religious liberty rights are protected. And why is religious liberty important? There's so many reasons, but one, if you don't have religious freedom rights, the state is the highest authority. It takes the authority from God. It can decide right and wrong. It can decide men and women. It's completely arbitrary. Whatever the state wants, it controls. But if you have religious freedom rights, it recognizes that we have a duty to our Creator. This is how James Madison, George Mason phrased it, that we have a duty to our Creator that cannot be forced by force of the state. It has to be driven by reason and our conviction. And so religious freedom recognizes that we create our government to protect our God-given rights. And that's the proper scope, and good laws will make sure that you can actually, like Joseph just said, live and speak the truth. Stand up. We have the truth. We have something compelling. We have what the world needs, and don't be shy of it. Prosecution, these are clients of ours, people that say persecution doesn't exist. Ask all of the groups of First Liberty, ADF, all of these groups that are representing folk that are ostracized, that are not given public benefits, that have to quiet their mouth for fear of being kicked out. And like you said, Nick, if you follow the common orthodoxy, as soon as you use the wrong speak, or if you try to go look at what they're doing with Gays Against Groomers, a group that's raising concern about gender identity things, those groups are ostracized. Are they a hate group that might even be on SPLC's hate list group? Gays Against Groomers a hate group because they're not completely 100% in the new orthodoxy. Our side is the one that for tolerance, for diversity, for the truth, charity. So I would just endear everyone to keep active. You're here, obviously you're active, but tell your neighbors to live and speak the truth and share the truth and love.
Let's give these speakers a round of applause.